Good morning, everybody, and thank you so much for joining us today. We are actually on episode 20 of Saved USC. However, this is our first one for 2021, so we're very excited to get this kicked off and going for the new year. And I think we can all agree 2021 is going to be a better year. It has to be, right? So I want to thank you all for joining us, and I want to thank our two presenters today. We have Jennifer Dooley and Jessica Ames, both with SoftPro. They have graciously agreed to show us the how to submit your 1099-S filings online with the assistance of SoftPro. We are going to be talking about two versions today. Some of it will overlap, but we are going to show you it in both as well. Jessica is going to do Classic, and Jennifer is going to do Select. So a lot of what they're talking about is going to kind of apply to both, but they're going to show it on their screen so that you guys can all see it. Per usual, if you have any questions, there is a questions feature. Just go ahead and type them in the box, and we will try and get to as many as possible. If we don't get to your question, don't worry. We send a recap email with a link to this as it is recorded so that you can listen to it later or view it. And we will answer any questions that we didn't get to in that recap email. So please make sure to go ahead and send them. I will try and answer as many as I can, and then we'll try and ask both Jessica and Jennifer some. And again, if we don't get to them, we will send it in a recap email as well. So just go ahead and send them in and know that we will get to them at some point. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Jessica. And thank you both, Jennifer and Jessica, for doing this for us. We really appreciate it. It's obviously timely with the 1099 season upon us. So thank you, Jessica. I'm going to let you go ahead and kick it off.
All right, thanks, Leslie. Hey, everybody, this is Jessica with SoftPro, and like Leslie said, we're going to be demonstrating for you how to prepare your IRS submission file in the Pro 1099 module, and then we're also going to demonstrate how we can get that uploaded to the IRS. And so, like she mentioned, I'm going to be walking through the process in our standard and enterprise versions. So for any of you attending the webinar or listening back to this later, if you are in your standard or enterprise version of our software, what I will demonstrate for you is what will apply to your process. And then once I'm all finished with that, I'm going to turn it over to Jennifer, and she's going to demonstrate how to create the submission file in Select. So the actual upload process, when we're ready to actually upload the file to the IRS website, that's going to be the same no matter what version you're in. So we're going to save that part for the end, and it will apply to everybody who is listening in on the webinar. So before we dive into actually using Pro 1099, we just wanted to go over some of the features, and this again applies to all versions. So with the Pro 1099 module, we can manage an unlimited number of 1099-S records, and the module will produce the IRS file that we will submit via the IRS Fire website. So doing our filings electronically eliminates the need for us to have those carbon 1099-S forms. It will automatically generate our two 1099-S forms for us to provide to our sellers, have them execute those at closings. There will be an exception report that we will generate, which will tell us when we are ready to go ahead and file with the IRS. And our Pro 1099 module is integrated with Proform. So we enter in our seller and our 1099 data one time, and it flows directly into Pro 1099 to create those records. So no need for us to do double duty typing out information more than once. So we have 5 basic steps that are going to cover the process we're going to go through before we create that submission file. So first, we need to make sure to set up and confirm that our transmitter and payer information is correct and current. We are going to run reports in the Pro 1099 module. So we need to make sure that all of our information that's required by the IRS is complete and correct. So that exceptions report will tell us if we're missing any information or if it's invalid, so we will need to make those corrections. Once our records are all clean, we have no more exceptions to correct. We will then create the submission file in the Pro 1099 module, and then we'll go out to the IRS Fire website and actually upload that submission file. So going back to that transmitter and payer information, one thing that we're going to need to do is if we've never filed electronically with the IRS, we will need to go to the IRS Fire website. You can access the Fire website from Pro 1099, whether you're in Standard or Enterprise, or if you're in Select. Of course, you can always go out online and Google it as well. But when you get to the website, you're going to need to create an account. So if you've never filed, you don't have an account, you'll need to set up a username and password. So when you come to the main page of the site, on the left-hand side is your menu options. So you will choose Create New Account. It'll have you set up your username. It'll have you set up a password. You also set up a PIN number, which to my recollection, I believe is still a 10-digit number. So you'll need all of that to file electronically. The other thing that you will need is a TCC. So that TCC is a transmitter control code. It's a code that's issued to you from the IRS, and you're required to have one if you're going to file electronically. We only need to apply for one time. So if you have filed electronically before, you have used Pro 1099 before, you most likely already have a TCC code. If you don't have a TCC code, you will need to come in to the IRS Fire website. You'll want to log in with that account information you created, and then you'll want to go to the fill-in form 4419. That's the form that we need to fill out to apply for that TCC code, and then the IRS will give that back to us after they receive our application. So if you've never used Pro 1099 and never filed electronically, if you have not already done this, I would suggest doing it as soon as possible. We are up against a deadline here in terms of filing our 1099s. So to file electronically, the deadline is March 31st. We need to make sure to submit that file to the IRS electronically by March 31st. The other deadline that we should note is when the seller needs to receive a copy of their 1099. So that deadline is February 15th. So we're approaching that one very quickly. Now, if you've provided copies of the 1099s at the actual closing table throughout 2020, you've already met that requirement. If you have any sellers that never received a copy of the 1099, you have until the 15th to mail them out a copy or send them a copy, however you can do that. All right, so March 31st is the big deadline that we are going to want to pay close attention to. All right, so let's go ahead and move into the actual Proform file. So I'm going to show you kind of where our information is entered, what we're required to enter within the file. So here I'm going to be demonstrating this in the version of Enterprise, but everything I'm going to show you applies to both Standard and Enterprise. So in the Proform file, we want to make sure we've got complete seller information. So I'm going to go into my seller screen under the General tab. We want to verify that we've got complete seller names, complete seller forwarding addresses. We assign our sellers the correct entity type. This is very important for 1099s. Anytime you mark one of your sellers as a corporation, they are automatically exempt from your 1099 reports. So they will not show up on your exceptions report. They will not be a part of your submission file to the IRS. So when you have a seller that's a corporation, you can certainly mark them as such, but if they are another type of business, do not mark them as a corporation. When in doubt, if the type you need is not in the list, you always have the option of other. This type also comes into play when we take a look at our name exceptions. So assigning that correct type is going to be very important for the 1099 process. It's also important that we divide up proceeds. So the proceeds percentages, when you have more than one seller, are going to not only split up your proceeds checks, but they're also going to split up your actual 1099s. With more than one seller, they each are going to be given a 1099 based on what percentage or how much of the proceeds that they received. If you click on the More button on either of these seller name lines, it's going to take you into a screen where you would enter in the Social Security number or the tax ID number for your seller contacts. So with individuals, we'll enter in the Social Security number. You want to make sure to enter that with the dashes. If you forget, the system will remind you. And if you have an entity with a tax ID number, you'll also want to enter in that tax ID with a dash. Again, if you don't have the correct number of digits or if you forget that dash, the system will notify you to correct it. There's one other place here in the Proform file where we will find 1099 data. So when you're in a CDF type file, it's going to be under your CDF tab. When you're in a HUD type file, it would be under your HUD tab. And it's going to be your division of proceeds and 1099 data screen. So this screen is again going to list my sellers as well as those proceeds splits that I set up from the seller screen. Keep in mind when you split up proceeds between multiple sellers, you can put in any kind of percentage that you need. However, once you're all done adjusting those percentages, you have to add up to exactly 100%. If you don't, the system will ding you and you will need to correct it. You will be able to see the cash to seller. These would be the net proceeds. So for example, the amount of the proceeds checks or proceeds wires. The 1099 is going to show gross proceeds. So based on the split, it's going to take your total sales price and then allocate it to each of your sellers. The buyer's part of real estate tax is also allocated based on the percentages of proceeds, and that's a number that's auto-calculated here in the Proform file. So the buyer's part of real estate tax is automatically calculated based on the tax amounts we enter into our tax proration screens. You'll note that here in the CDF file, screens 6, 7, and 8 under the CDF tab are used to prorate taxes. You want to make sure to use those 3 screens only for real estate taxes, and your 1099 is the reason why. That buyer's part of real estate tax auto-calculates based on the numbers and the tax amounts we put into those screens. So if you're in a place where you only have maybe 1 or 2 types of taxes, you see that assessment screen and you think, great, I'm going to use this because there's an HOA and I have to prorate those dues. If you're using that assessment screen to prorate something that has nothing to do with taxes, you're throwing off your 1099. So just keep in mind that those proration screens are used only for taxes. On my 1099 data screen, I have some columns with checkboxes. The first column is your property or services received. So if the seller received property in lieu of or in addition to proceeds, then you can check off that box. Next is your foreign person checkbox. If the seller is not a U.S. citizen, you can identify them as a foreign person. The next 2 columns are 1099 given to seller and 1099 signed. You can use those for your records, for your purposes, so that you know when a 1099 was provided to the seller and when or if it was signed by that seller. The last column is your exemption. So if the seller meets the criteria to be exempt from 1099 reporting, you will identify them as exempt with the exempt checkbox. Now, when you have a seller that's a corporation, they are automatically exempt, so that checkbox is going to be grayed out. It's already checked off for you. The last piece of info I want to double check and make sure it's complete on this screen is the property description. So by default, the Proform file is going to pull in your property address here. But if for whatever reason you have a property that doesn't have a mailing address, maybe it's a vacant piece of land, you need to somehow describe that property, and you need to describe it in 39 characters or less. That is the limit set by the IRS. So that's what we have to work with when we identify our properties. So in terms of the actual 1099 documents, we can generate those right from the Proform file. If we go into the SoftPro Ready Doc tree, we'll go under Escrow and Closing. You'll find a folder in there called Tax Forms. And then inside that Tax Forms folder is a subfolder for your 1099 docs. So this is where you can generate your substitute 1099 that the seller can execute and you can provide them a copy. You also have your certification for no information reporting, so that will determine whether or not your seller meets that criteria to be an exempt party. So once I've confirmed that my seller and 1099 information is complete and accurate here in the Proform file, I need to export this information to Pro 1099 so that once I'm ready to do that submission file for the IRS, my records are there and my records are complete. So if I want to individually export this file to Pro 1099, I'm going to click on my File menu. I'm going to choose Export and then Export to Pro 1099. So that will launch Pro 1099 for me and it will create my records. Once the records are complete, it'll let me know how many were created. So in this case, I had 2 different sellers, therefore I had 2 records that get created, and it just reminds me that I should take a look at those and make sure they're not missing any information. So we will run our exceptions report to check all of our records. Before I do that, I wanted to show you another way of pulling information from Proform here into Pro 1099. If you want to do a multiple file import, so I want to grab a whole bunch of files that cover a certain time period. So let's say I want to do this once a month, for example. You can pull in all the closings for that month that you choose by coming into Pro 1099. You'll go to your File menu and you will choose to import multiple Proform files. We import by settlement date range. So if I want to bring in my records from the month of December in 2020, for example, I can put in those dates For a file to import, it does need to meet certain criteria. It's going to look to see if the file's settlement date falls within that date range, if the file is marked as a purchase, and if it has a seller entered. It has to meet that criteria in order for a record to be created. So it's not going to go out and grab, for example, your refinance type transactions. You do have the option of directing Pro 1099 to one certain location on your server or on your network where your pro form data files are stored. You can leave that blank though. It is not required to type anything there. And then I have the option to choose whether or not I want to create records that have sellers in them that got zero proceeds, or if I want to overwrite any records that may have already been exported to Pro 1099. So you can make your selections and then you'll click OK. It does let me know that I didn't put in a path. Are you sure you want to continue? We can say yes. And then it'll let me know how many qualifying files it found in that date range. To import them all, I'll click yes. Now keep in mind that this looks first and foremost at the settlement date. It does not matter what the status of that file is. It doesn't matter that it canceled. It doesn't matter that you never dispersed it. As long as it meets that criteria of being a purchase transaction within that date range that has at least one seller contact entered, a record will be created. Now, if it meets some of that criteria but not all, you will see that there is an error log that gets produced. So if you get any errors in the import process, on this message, there'll be a button here to the left that says View Import Error Log. You can open that up and it'll list for you the files that it tried to import but couldn't, and it'll give you the reason why. So for example, a file may be marked as a purchase, but there's no seller entered. Or there's a file marked as a refinance, but it does have a seller in it. So you can then review those files to make sure that none of them need to actually have records created. So one of the biggest questions I get is, well, how do I prevent my canceled files from exporting or importing into Pro 1099? The best and easiest way to do that is in Proform. When you have a file that cancels, you should go into wherever your settlement date was entered, so Express Order Entry if you're using Express Order Entry, or here into your settlement date screen, and clear out that settlement date. If it doesn't fall within a date range, it won't be a part of the import. If it doesn't have a settlement date, it's never going to fall in any date range that you put in. So that is one way to be sure your files will not import if they have canceled. Those of us using Express Order Entry know that we have a settlement status. It does not matter that you mark a file as canceled. It will still import if it meets the other criteria. All right, let's go back to Pro 1099. So once all of my records for my time period are in, so like I said earlier, we suggest that you do this more than once a year. Once a month, you should do a multiple file import, run your exceptions report. If you don't do a whole lot of closings throughout the year, maybe at least do it once a quarter so that we're not waiting until January of the next year, doing a mass import for the entire calendar year, running an exceptions report that's going to be 50 pages long, and we're going to have to clean up all these records. The more often you do this, the easier and quicker your filing process will go. So once I'm confirmed that the records I want to pull in are here, I'm going to go to my reports and I'm going to choose to run my exception report. And I'm going to run that for the current tax year. And I'm going to go ahead and do a print preview so you guys can see it. So we're going to have two different kinds of exceptions on the report. The most important ones, the first ones we're going to see, are exceptions for invalid or insufficient information. There is certain information the IRS is going to require be on each of our records. If we're missing any of that required info, the exception report will tell us. So missing a tax ID or a social security number, missing an address, missing a sales price or a settlement date. So we will need to fix every single invalid or insufficient note here on the exception report. So we'll need to go back to each of those files, update the file with that information, and then we should re-export into Pro 1099. We suggest always going back to the Proform file, making your corrections there, then just singularly re-exporting that one file into Pro 1099 so that the Pro 1099 database and the Proform files are consistent. You're also going to see some warning messages. We will see warnings on our exception report for those two checkboxes I mentioned earlier, 1099 given to seller and 1099 signed. If you take a look at your actual records, those two checkboxes are in the section labeled information not submitted to the IRS. Those are there for you, for your records. If you don't want to see the warnings on the exception report, you need to check off those boxes in each of your records. So we are not ready to create our submission file until all of these invalid or insufficient exceptions are completely gone. The other kind of exception we're going to see, if I scroll through this report, is going to be our name exceptions. Name exceptions sometimes need to be corrected, sometimes we can leave them go. They are never going to fall off of your report, but they are there as a warning. You can see that they're all listed as warning in case there are adjustments that we need to make to those name exceptions. So I have a table. I'll show you some example name exceptions that we might see and how do we get those corrected. So number one, we've got corporations. If you see any corporations listed on your exception report, they shouldn't be there. They're corporations, they're exempt. So that means they weren't actually marked as a corporation in your Proform file. So you should go back to Proform, go into that file, mark that seller as a corporation, re-export to Pro 1099. Now the format your individual seller names will show on each of the records is last name, comma, first. All of your other entity types should show exactly as their name would on any legal document. So when you have a business, an estate, a trust, if they're showing in the format of last name, comma, first, like I have my LLC, comma, ABC Builders, or my estate, comma, John Smith, then that means they're marked as an individual in the Proform file, and we just need to fix that. So again, we go into the Proform file, we update that entity type, we re-export to Pro 1099. And then the opposite of that would be if you do have an individual who isn't showing on the record as last name, comma, first, we need to go back, mark them as an individual male or female, and then re-export to Pro 1099. So like I said earlier, we always suggest that you make your changes in the Proform file and then re-export each of those files individually into Pro 1099 so that both databases match. There are a few examples where we either don't have to make a correction at all, or we can make the correction right in Pro 1099. So the one classic example we have for that is Eddie Van Halen. When I export a file in which Eddie Van Halen is the seller, it's going to come into the record as Halen, comma, Eddie Van. Well, his true last name is Van Halen. Van is not his middle name. So this is an example of one I could correct right in the record. I just need to move that word Van to the beginning of his name so that it shows last name, comma, first. You will see name exceptions for names that actually don't need to be corrected at all. Anytime you have an individual seller that has a suffix, like a junior or senior, your estate names, your business names, trusts, as long as they're showing on the record exactly as they would on, say, a deed or any legal document, there's no correction that needs to be made. So here are some examples of your Proform file versus your Pro 1099 record. Should they look the same or should they look different? So here's an example with an LLC. The Proform file and the record, the names look exactly the same. Same with your estates. The way that your Proform file is entered, as long as you mark them as an estate, the record should look the exact same way. Now here's the difference with an individual. In the Proform file, it's going to read first name, middle name or initial, last name. The record's going to be last name, comma, first. So this is one that's different from the record to the actual Proform file. And then here's that Eddie Van Halen example. This is one correction that we do need to make manually in the Pro 1099 record. So with our exceptions report, we are going to run this exceptions report over and over and over again until we can clear out all of the exceptions for invalid or insufficient information. We also need to run through the name exceptions, fix the ones that need corrected, verify the ones that don't need corrected are fine, we don't need to change those. And once we're at that point, we would now be ready to go ahead and create the submission file. So the last thing that we should do before we are ready to go ahead and create that submission file, we need to make sure our transmitter information is current and correct in Pro 1099. You can do this at any point, but it's always a good idea right before you create your submission file that you double check that information. Is it current? Do you have the right contact name and phone number and email here? And is my TCC code entered? This is required, needs to be filled out before we create that submission file. The other thing we need to do is every single tax year, we need to update Pro 1099. The way that I know how I'm currently set up in Pro 1099, what tax year am I ready for, I can go to my help menu and I can choose About Pro 1099. As of right now, this is set up for the 2019 tax year. So until I update, I cannot create a submission file for any tax year beyond 2019. To update Pro 1099, I can go to SoftPro 360 in ProForm. You'll find your Pro 1099 updater right at the top of your services list. It's a really quick install, should be very simple for you. If you have any issues with it though, you can always reach out to our support team. So you need to make sure to update before you create your submission file. So when I'm ready to create the file, I'm going to go to my Tools menu and I'm going to choose Produce IRS Submission File. And it's just going to walk me through a series of screens where I'm going to verify information and answer some questions. This first screen is reminding me about the TCC code and reminding me about filling out my transmitter and payer information. You can access that information and make edits to it right from the file wizard. And then we'll click OK. And then this screen, it's reminding me, hey, if it's not early 2020, if it's early 2021, this should say 2020. This is another indication, since it says 2019, that I have not done my update. So I would need to cancel out of here, go into SoftPro 360 in ProForm, and run that updater so that I can move into the 2020 tax year. So then I'm going to click OK. Now it's going to ask me if this is a corrected return, and it is not. This is the first time we're filing for 2020. So I'm going to say no, it's not a corrected. Is this a replacement filing? And I'm going to say no, because again, this is the first filing we're making for 2020. Then I'm going to choose a location to save my file in. I'm just going to go ahead and throw it on the desktop. It's going to confirm that I want to save that file to my desktop. I'm going to click OK again, and it will let me know how many records I have that are flagged as corporations. So you should have an idea of how many corporation sellers you have in your system, so you can be comfortable with that number. And then we'll click OK. And we need to confirm that we understand that we should keep these records for at least 3 years. And then once you click OK again, it lets you know where the file was saved at. It lets you know what the file was named, and it's now our responsibility to go out to the IRS Fire website and upload that file to the IRS. So we're still not done yet. If you want to access the website right now, when you click yes, it'll take you to that site. I'm going to go ahead and click no right now because I'm going to make Jennifer our new presenter. She's going to walk through how this process works in Select, and then she'll take you all through the website because, like I said earlier, once you create the submission file, the process for actually uploading it is the same no matter what version that you're in.
Hey, Jessica,
So Jen,
I'm sorry, Jessica, this is Leslie. Can I ask a quick question before Jennifer starts? Somebody said, how do you run the 1099 exception report that will display the name control? I don't see that on my exception report.
So here in the standard and enterprise version in Pro 1099, under the reports menu, that's where you're going to find the exception report.
Okay, great. And then one other question we have here, it says, if a trust or estate is using a social security number instead of a TIN, do we manually issue the 1099 to correct the information to show it as an individual?
So you could correct the record. There is a way to manually create 1099s here in Pro 1099, so you can manually create a record. There's a new record icon there on your toolbar. So if you wanted to manually create a record for that individual, you could, or you could still export the file from ProForm and then edit as needed for the name of the individual.
Okay, and then last question before we turn it over to Jennifer is, if we only handle the buyer side, like a split closing, do they take the date out Or just not create a 1099?
You can either just not export. So if you are not going to be responsible for 1099 reporting, someone else is going to be doing it. You could either just not export that file, or if you're going to be using that multiple file import and you know you're going to end up catching that file at some point anyway, then you would want to take the settlement date out so that a record doesn't get created. So if you have a mix of files that some of them you have to report, some of them you don't, I would suggest individually exporting only the files that you need to do instead of doing that multiple file import. And I would do it as often as possible. I would not wait to the end of the year and try and figure that all out because it's going to be a nightmare.
Okay, I think we're good for now. So we're going to turn it over to Jennifer. And just a reminder, Jennifer is going to walk us through the process in Select and then also some with the IRS. So thank you.
Hello, everyone. I'm Jennifer Dooley. So you guys should be able to see my screen there now. So I'm going to go over the setup, Pro 1099, creating the submission file in our select version, and then we're going to walk through the upload to the IRS, which, as Jessica indicated, is really the same in both versions. So once you've obtained your TCC, that transmitter control code, you can enter that into Pro 1099, and you can also verify your transmitter or payer information by accessing our SP admin. So you'll notice I have a tab here for our SP admin. This is a permissionable tab, so if you do not see this tab or module, that means you do not have permission to access that, and you would have to find someone with permission there. So you are going to click on that tab, and then you're going to click on this configuration icon here. Once you click on the configuration, you'll notice that your management console opens here in its own tab, and you do want to navigate to enter in the 1099 information or verify it in the left-hand side under your profiles. So under the security folder in the left-hand pane, you're going to click on the profiles. You're then going to double-click on the profile that will be used to prepare the 1099 submission. So I'm just going to grab my Florida there. Once I double-click, I do have a 1099 tab. This is where I need to verify or enter the information for my 1099 transmittal. So you do have your payor name there. You're going to enter the name of the payer who owns that tax ID or TIN number. Filers shouldn't enter a transfer agent's name in this field. Any transfer agent's name should appear in the second payor name field. You do have your tax ID number you can enter, and then your name control. This is obtained from the mailing label on the package 1099 that is mailed to most payers in December from the IRS. If you need further information, if you did not receive that mailing label, we do have an IRS Fire guide that we update yearly, and I'll show you at the end of this presentation how to access that. You can then enter that TCC or transmitter control code in this field. So this would be that code that Jessica had indicated was obtained by the IRS, and it's required before a file can be submitted electronically via the IRS Fire system. So Pro 1099 will require that this TCC number be entered on this screen. If you don't have it, you do need to apply for one, and you can do that via the IRS Fire website. That was what Jessica showed in her slideshow at the beginning there. Under the contact name, you do want to enter the name of the person to be contacted if the IRS encounters any problems with the file or the transmission. And you can see here you can enter in the company name, the mailing address as well. We do have some options over here to the left. By default, the export only escrow closed orders will not be checked. If you do choose to check this box, that means that not only does the order have to meet the regular criteria that we'll get into to produce the 1099 over to the Pro 1099 module, but the escrow status also has to be designated as closed as well. By default, the payor functions as transmitter will be checked. If you do not function as the transmitter, you can uncheck this box. And then what happens is this transmitter button over here to the right becomes ungrayed out so that you can enter in the transmitter's information. The display TCC warning will automatically be checked. This will display a warning message if you do not have that TCC or transmitter control code on this particular profile. So once you've set up all that information there in your management console, In Select, there is actually no export that is required for 1099. So as Jessica showed you in the Enterprise and Standard version, you did have to export your file over to Pro 1099. If you have certain criteria in your order in our Select version, a 1099 is going to automatically populate over to this Pro 1099 module. So you do have the Pro 1099 tab there. And it sort of just waits there for you to prepare that submission file and do the upload to the IRS. So what is some of that criteria? The transaction type does have to be indicated as a purchase, so it's not going to try to send, refis and things like that. The settlement date also has to be in the past. So if the settlement date is not in the past, then it's not going to meet that criteria yet. So to make my file, I'm actually going to go ahead and adjust my settlement date to today. The estimated box, whether it is checked or not, does actually not have any bearing on that. It's going to look at the settlement date. Also, the order cannot be checked to exclude from IRS submission. So checking this box to exclude the order from IRS submission really means I don't want a 1099 to be populated because I have no responsibility to do one. This sometimes comes apparent in maybe a title only situation, or sometimes if you're doing a single-sided transaction like we had the question on earlier and we don't want an actual 1099 to be produced. This does not mean exempt. I will show you where you can indicate that a file is exempt. So it's also going to make sure that you haven't manually excluded this from IRS submission. Under your order contact screen, you do have to have a seller contact in your order to make it meet that criteria to produce a 1099 over to that module for the IRS. Now, the seller's name does not actually have to be filled in. There just has to be a seller contact sitting on this screen. The last screen is your status screen over here to the left. And in this status screen, it is not going to try to send anywhere your order or escrow status is marked as canceled, duplicate, or on hold. So remember, we do want to be canceling out orders if they fall through. That ensures that a 1099 does not get populated. Also, that previous setting that I showed you where the export only orders with an escrow closed status comes into play here. If you have checked that option in your profile in SoftPro Select, then it is also going to make sure that the escrow status is closed. But remember, that is by default not checked. Also, just something to kind of note here, Pro 1099 records will be created even if there's no posted receipts or disbursements in the register. When you create your submission file, you can check to include any with zero seller proceeds if you like. So now once your file has met all that criteria, so we've gone through what the criteria should be there. If you are missing something that the IRS needs for that transmission, you will start receiving warnings inside your file. So when I save my order now, and I'm just going to hit the little diskette up here in the top left, if I'm missing any information that it needs for the IRS, it will pop up and warn me inside my file here. So notice I get a warning. Now remember, a warning in Select does not stop you from saving. It still allows me to save my file, but it's saying, hey, you want to probably take a look at this. And it says seller associated with code S2 is missing the following information required by the IRS for 1099 reporting. And it will tell you exactly what it needs from you. So I did not give the seller's tax ID or social, their forwarding address, and I have not said whether a 1099 has been provided or signed. So under my order contact screen in the left-hand side here, for my sellers, I do have a place, if I open up the contact, to put in their social security numbers. So it's warning me that I have omitted to enter that information, which is a required field for the IRS. So I can enter in that information in my order. And then also your forwarding address is really important. So the forwarding address is going to be reported to the IRS with the 1099. You do have the drop down to indicate and select if it's the same as your property or the same as the current address, or you can actually just type in your own forwarding address. So now if I save my order, we should see that warning go away. But I still haven't indicated anywhere to the system. So notice now my warning just says, have you provided and have they signed a 1099? The rest of that information that it's asking you about can be located under the escrow and closing screens. So if I open up the escrow and closing, you do have a seller proceeds and 1099 screen. This is almost like a snapshot of what your 1099 is going to look like over in the 1099 module, and it is asking me to give the system some information here to help me track whether I have provided and they have signed the 1099 already, or if they are exempt from 1099 reporting. So you will see the description will automatically populate for you. You also have both. I had 2 sellers in my order, so I have both of my sellers listed here on the screen, their name. If there is a joint contact in your order, it will put the second name in the continuation of name. Their percentage of ownership, this can be adjusted here. This is going to affect how it reports to the IRS for the gross proceeds, as well as how it divides up their funds from closings, if they're getting any money from closing. In SoftPro Select, this really just pulled directly from your contact screen. When I entered in these contacts under my order contacts. You can adjust it here, and it's the same as really going back to the order contacts and adjusting it. How much cash my actual sellers are getting, what the gross proceeds are going to be reported to the IRS, and notice it divided it amongst their ownership percentage. And then if the buyer has any part of the real estate tax, just like you saw in Standard or Enterprise, it's going to display it here based on their ownership percentages. And just like Jessica indicated in Standard or Enterprise, in Select, you do have some tax screens over here to the left. You have city, town, county, assessments, and additional taxes. And that does pull directly and talk to the 1099. So if the buyer is sharing in any part of the taxes, you do want to make sure you're not using these for anything other than tax prorations so that it does report to the IRS correctly. You also have some check boxes here that you may check when they are appropriate. So if the seller receives services in lieu of or addition to money, so possibly maybe a 1031 exchange, you can report that to the IRS by checking this box. If the seller indicates that they're a foreign entity, then you can also report that by checking the foreign entity, or you should report that to the IRS. And then you do have whether the 1099 has been provided and signed. If so, I'm going to check these 2 boxes to indicate that. Just as Jessica indicated in Standard or Enterprise, this becomes a way for you to track who you have provided the 1099s to, and we do suggest at SoftPro that you receive a signed copy back. Now, if Jake and Jody tell me that they are subject to 1099, I have provided it and they have signed it, once I indicate that in the system and save my order, notice I do not receive any more warnings pop up. So I didn't see anything pop up there on the screen, and I have 0 warnings. I have now given the file everything it needs for this 1099 submission. Now, what if Jake and Jody were exempt from 1099 reporting? Then in that case, I may not have provided and signed. They may have filled out the exemption paperwork and met the criteria, and I determined that they were exempt. And in that case, I can check the exempt box. When I save, I will also have cleared up all of my warnings there in the system. Now, notice that We Sell Houses Inc. here was automatically marked exempt from 1099 reporting. On the order contact screen, if your seller is a corporation, so if you choose organization and you indicate the type as a corporation, the system will automatically mark them exempt from 1099 reporting. So just be careful if the seller is not a true corporation that you are adjusting this type drop down appropriately, since that will affect how it's reported to the IRS. This is where you indicate exempt. You do not want to check exclude order from IRS submission to indicate someone is exempt. The exclude order from IRS submission just really means I have no fiduciary responsibility to do that 1099. So we do actually have the 1099 and exemption forms inside of our document trees inside SoftPro Select. So if I navigate to my order tab and I click on the documents icon, if I come over here to the search in the right hand side here and type in 1099. We do give you quite a few 1099s that you can use. I like this 1099-S form signature supplemental. And then we also have some exemption forms if you need those as well. So if I type in exemption, and we do have a supplemental or a default document there. And then remember, you can hit preview over here on the right-hand side to take a look. Because I have multiple sellers in my order, it's going to ask me which one I'm trying to produce a 1099 for. So we'll just say Jake and Jody. We do at SoftPro recommend that you include the tax ID solicitation. This is what has them sign. So notice it has a place there for them to sign. And then if I hit the next button, this is our exemption form that will help you determine if they're exempt. So those can kind of be used in conjunction with this seller proceeds and 1099-S screen for you to indicate if you have provided and they have signed at closing or if they are exempt. And those do affect the warnings that you see inside the file. So what if a user ignores those warnings? How do you know from an administrative standpoint that everything has been given that it needs? This is where the 1099-S exceptions report comes into play. If those warnings are not addressed inside the file, they're not giving the sellers the social security numbers or tax IDs, the forwarding address, and saying whether they have provided and signed or they're exempt from 1099 reporting, then the file will fall onto this exception report. So to get to the exception report inside SoftPro Select, you're going to click on the Pro 1099 tab, and you do have a little reports icon here. When I single click, my Pro 1099 reports pop up over here to the left. I'm just going to hit the little pin there and pin it down so we can see what we have inside here. So we do have a 1099-S exceptions report, and then we have a supplemental as well. The supplemental will let you add additional parameters such as sorting it by escrow officer if you would like. So you do want to run this exceptions report because it's going to list all the records which need to be corrected. It's going to tell you things like the missing social security numbers, even if there's a partial address, some of the legal description missing, the gross proceeds. When this report runs with no errors, then you're actually ready to create your IRS submission file. So this is going to list all the non-exempt 1099 records that contain one or more exceptions for the tax year that I'm going to specify when I run it. We do suggest at SoftPro for maintenance purposes that you run this at least once a month, because honestly, this is going to be the most time-consuming part of you transmitting to the IRS. You're going to run this exception report, clear up these warnings inside these files by giving it the appropriate information, and then rerun the exception report until you have a clear report. So this report's really going to help you in accurately identifying and resolving those exceptions to reduce the risk of needing to file a corrected return. So to run it, whether I run the default or the supplemental, I'm just going to double click. I'm going to put in my reporting year. So in this case, I'm trying to report on 2020, and then I'm going to click OK. When the file falls onto this exception report, notice it will tell me exactly what is missing. So right now I have 3 orders here that fell onto my exception report. I would want to open up those orders and give it the missing information, and then it would in turn fall off of this report. We also do have a 1099 duplicate record listing that you can run here that we suggest. So this report will list all records where 2 or more records contain the same social security number in an order. So one of the duplicates may actually need to be deleted prior to creating the submission file, and it is over here in the same navigation pane. So we do have that duplicate record listing as well. So once I've ran that exception report, now I'm ready to create the 2020 submission file. The first step that I normally start with is if you have previously submitted to the IRS, when you create this submission file, you're really going to save it somewhere on your computer. I do suggest that you verify whatever location that you normally save these, verify the name of this file before you start your current year upload, or previous year in this case, because it always names it IRS tax. There is a requirement that you keep this for 3 years. So you do want to rename this at this point if this was last year's submission. So I may want to go in and just click on it there and name it, 2019 if I have not already done so. If I leave it IRS tax, my new submission file for 2020 that I create will overwrite that. So you do want to verify that you have renamed that. So I usually do that first. Then I'm going to go into SoftPro. Again, I want to make sure my exception report is clear. I'm going to access the Pro 1099 module, and I'm going to choose the Create Submission file. You will receive a message pop up that tells you what tax year you are trying to submit. So this should say for this year, tax year 2020, and it says you should now be in early 2021. So you want to make sure those dates are all showing up correctly. If you don't see the current tax year, or you don't see 2020 here, you need to stop and cancel. Hit the cancel button, and you need to contact SoftPro support to have your application updated. So just as Jessica said, with the standard or enterprise, Select does require an update to this, and you would reach out to the support department in our Select version to get that update. So I'm in the correct, so we're just going to hit next here. I can enter in my TCC code and my payer's tax ID number here. So remember, the TCC code is your transmitter control code. If you have multiple tax ID numbers for a single TCC code, you actually may leave the tax ID number blank, and your file will include an A and B record for each tax ID number associated with that TCC code you entered. If you would like to submit separate files for each tax ID, then you do want to make sure you are entering your payer's tax ID number here before hitting next. If this is a test submission, and we do recommend that if this is your first time you're ever submitting to the IRS, you may want to make a test submission file and submit it first. It will send just 11 records. Then you can check that box. We're not doing a test submission, so I'm going to click next. You can confirm your tax reporting year there, and then you do have the option to include records with a 00 seller proceeds. It will not include those unless you check this box. I'm then going to hit next. I can indicate if this is a corrected return or not. So we're going to say no, this is the first original return. This is where I want to browse out and enter that destination directory for where I want to save the file that we are now creating that we will ultimately upload to the IRS. So I'm going to hit browse, and I put mine on my desktop in this 1099 tax files. And I'm going to click next. This is where you do need to check that you understand that the IRS does want you to maintain this data for 3 years, and then you can hit next. It's going to process and create that file. Now, if you have any exceptions on your exception report, you will receive a pop-up that says you understand penalties may be incurred. It still allows you to transmit with those exceptions, so you can still generate the IRS submission regardless of if there's exceptions, but you are encouraged at this point to cancel the wizard and verify and correct all of those exceptions by running that exception report instead of continuing with this submission. So I'm going to say, yes, I understand, because I have some exceptions. We're going to click next. Now, it does tell me that it has created that electronic file. It tells me where it placed it. And then I do have the option to go directly to the IRS Fire website right now and go ahead and do my transmission. I'm going to hit finish, and I want to show you where it saved that. So if I open up that 1099 tax files, there is my transmission that I just did. Notice it names it IRS tax. You can go ahead at this point if you wanted to and rename it with maybe 2020 after it. Then that first step I showed you where I renamed the prior year would already be done. So now if I'm ready to actually transmit that to the Fire website, then I can access that in Select through the Pro 1099 tab through the Open IRS Fire. That just opens up and navigates to the IRS Fire's website. You can just navigate there directly. And in standard or enterprise, there's also a way to access it through the application. So now is where we're getting into where the two tie together. So Jessica showed you standard or enterprise. I showed you select. But this piece, now once the transmission file has been created, is where they come back together and really look the same. So since I'm not going to really submit this to the IRS, I have a lot of fake files in here, not real files, right? Then I'm going to pull up my slideshow and let's walk through what this will look like for you. So whether you choose to navigate there by hitting the Open IRS Fire inside Select, or you just navigate directly to their website, then you are going to want to hit the log on there. That's where you're going to put in the username and password that you created when you created your login. You're going to choose to send the information returns because you need to grab that file that you created. You can enter in your TCC, or you're going to enter in the TCC and the tax ID or Social Security number here and then hit submit. You'll verify your filing information and then click accept. And then you want to choose original file. It does give you a brief explanation to the right of what all of those are, but this is the original time we're sending it. You're going to enter in that PIN, so that PIN that Jessica mentioned when she was going over the slideshow that she had, that unique number that they gave you. If you have forgotten that PIN, you can call the IRS at that number listed below. And then you will browse out where you saved that submission file. You will grab it. So I'm going to choose that browse. It's going to take me to find that. In my case, I saved it on my desktop in that particular folder, and then I can hit upload. So once the IRS file has been uploaded, then you can come back to the IRS Fire website and you can check on that file status. I do think the IRS will send you an email, but you can access and check on it. You can check the file status after you log in by clicking that link. You're going to enter in the TCC and the TIN number and choose your search options to the right. And then we do have some examples of what we've seen. So the very first example that I have is a return that is not yet processed. Maybe they're still in the submission phase where they're still processing your submission. If it's been good and released, you'll see a result of good and released. And then if it's a bad submission, then you'll see bad, and that may mean that you need to make a corrected submission. And then just to leave you guys with this, we do have a lot of job aids out there. If you hit F1 from any screen inside Standard, Enterprise, or Select version, you can get to our web help. From there, if you hit the home button in the top left of that web page, you do have some job aids, some videos, and a fact page here in regard to the 1099. I highly suggest that under the job aids, if you click on Pro 1099, we do have the new IRS Fire System and Pro 1099 guide updated for 2020 tax year. So this is going to be a huge resource for you to help you in all the setup, the things that we went over. That name control, I said I would refer you somewhere if you needed some help with that. That's going to be shown in that guide. And then I'm going to leave you here with the key dates in case you guys didn't get that from the slideshow earlier. So these are the dates that you need to make note of when your filing deadlines are, extensions, and things of that nature. And Leslie, I will turn it back over to you.
Great, thank you so much. That was really nice, good information. So I do have some questions. I don't know that we're going to be able to get through all of them, but I will ask a few. I know we're kind of limited on time. So and the first one is, somebody says they have 2 branches, each with tax ID numbers, but to date have filed under their home office ID. Do you think they should separate them, or like where would they find that determination? I'm not sure if that's something you know, or if we should just direct them to the IRS.
Yeah, I think that would be more of an IRS question as to how they need to file that.
Yeah. The next one is, and obviously, Jessica, I know you're still on the line. You can jump in on any of these as well. But the next one is, you said corporations will not get a 1099. Do LLCs receive a 1099?
So that would be another one I would definitely check with the IRS about. In our system, corporations will automatically be marked exempt, but only corporations. LLCs will not.
Okay.
Yeah,
But I would definitely
I
check with
agree.
the IRS on the determination of whether
A
they should or should not.
corporation is the only entity that is exempt. An LLC is not a corporation, so they are not automatically exempt.
Okay. This one says, if the seller is marked or checked off as a foreign seller, why do they appear on the exceptions report as no tax ID entered and warnings pop up?
So in SoftPro Select, you will still receive warnings if you have not put in a tax ID, and that is one exception that is an exception to submitting to the IRS. If you see those exceptions and you know it's a foreign seller and they have not been provided a tax ID or social security number, those warnings will still appear, but you can still submit to the IRS.
Okay, great. Somebody asked, how can an admin run a report to see which file the closing team has marked as exclude so admin can double check?
So you could run a work list on exclude order from IRS submission. That is a very popular work list that people run in the system. I'm not thinking of a report off the top of my head. Jessica, help me if I'm missing one.
No, I don't think there is a report. I think it would just be a work list.
Okay. Someone said they were a little confused on how to get to the submission report in standard, Jessica.
The submission report or? Okay.
Yeah, they said they were a little confused on how I get the submission report. They work in standard.
Okay, well, there is no submission report. We create the submission file. So you go to your tools menu in Pro 1099 to create the submission file. That creates the file that gets uploaded to the IRS Fire website. In terms of reports, we have an exception report that you will find in Pro 1099 underneath your reports menu. And the exception report tells you what records you have that are missing or have incomplete information.
Okay, great. This one says, how did you create the 1099 tax file which needed to be renamed with the year? I think that might be
so the wizard. Yeah, the wizard that I walked through with you guys. So let me take the slideshow down. That's what created the transmission file. So when I hit this create submission file, that is you creating that submission file and browsing out and putting it somewhere. It is just always going to name it IRS tax. So if you have, this is not your first transmission, like maybe I did one in 2019, then if I never rename that file, then I want to go ahead and rename that. So the reason I had another one out here is this was my pretend 2019. In the system. For you, it would be your real.
Right.
But this was my transmission in 2019. So I didn't want 2020s to overwrite my previous year because this was my second year submitting. So I went in and renamed it. Just like really right now, I could come in and I could rename this to 2020, and then I save myself that step next year. But each time you create a submission file, it is always just going to call it IRS tax. And remember, we did receive that warning that we had to acknowledge saying that we agree to keep this file for 3 years. So you don't want it to overwrite your previous.
Okay.
Hopefully that clarifies.
Yeah, and I think we just have like one or two left. So it just says their TCC is entered in SP admin, but not showing up in their exception report. How can they fix that?
I'm not sure that that actually shows up. Let me look.
Yeah, I was wondering if it actually is part of that report. It's part of the file, but I don't think it's part of the report, right?
Well, when you get here, it does show that you can limit this report by your TCC code. If it's entered into SP admin, it should appear here. Now, whether they're checking it or not, I don't check it for mine because I only have the one. I would definitely say if they're not seeing it here and they have it in SP admin, they want to reach out to support.
Okay, makes sense. And then I think the last one is, and this is a pretty good question that might apply to a lot of people. One says, we changed over from standard to select January of 2020, and they have just one 1099 from standard that needs to be submitted. Do you know if they can submit both files to the IRS, or do they have?
Yes.
Yes. Okay.
Yeah, and I think that we do suggest that if you are coming from one version to another, then usually that year you will have 2 transmissions. So you'll have one out of standard or enterprise, and then you'll have one out of select as well. And that is, I believe, the easiest way to do it is to have 2 separate transmissions.
Okay. And then I'm only going to ask this last one here because we kind of gave an answer on it, but it says work list does not offer exclude as a choice, only exempt. I think from the program, it's kind of the same thing, correct? But you can explain that.
No, there is a checkbox here. I'm not 100% off the top of my head if that's an item that you can do with a work list. I would have to take a look, but you should be able somehow to query that field to exclude the order from IRS submission, which is different than exempt.
Okay, so that might just be something. Go ahead, sorry.
I'll have to look into the work list and see. I'm just assuming you could do it with a work list, but I don't know off the top of my head without playing with it.
That makes sense. And also, and just to answer your question, is just because the one you see in there isn't doing it doesn't mean it can't be done. It might just mean that you need to query it or maybe call support and have a report created or some assistance with that. So we can certainly help with that and pull that information if possible. So. Okay, so I think we are done. I appreciate everyone's time. Thank you so much for joining us. We'll resume doing Saved You a Seat episodes every 2 weeks. Please join us when you can. And remember, when you do sign up, if you're unable to join us, you'll get a recap email with a link so that you can watch or listen to the recording at a later time. If you have any further questions, please feel free to send them to me. I'm happy to reach out to both Jessica and Jennifer and get the answers for you and include them in that recap email. We really appreciate your time. We thank you, Jennifer and Jessica, for your time. Jessica, I know you have to run. You have another training, so thank you so much. And with that, I think we're going to sign off, and we'll see you all in 2 weeks. Thank you.
Thank you, guys.